Good morning, everyone. My name is Glen Howard. I'm president of the Jamestown Foundation, and we're delighted that you're here with us today. We have a very exciting event. It's often not every day in Washington that Ben Hodges is here in person and not remote from Germany. So we're happy that he's going to be talking to us today. The title of his event is an assessment after Kherson, assessment of Ukraine's successful counteroffensive. Many of you know General Hodges. He's a former commanding general, U.S. Army Europe. He's also currently a senior advisor at Human Rights First. And he's also the author of Future War and the Defense of Europe that was published by Oxford University Press. And so we're delighted that he's here with us today. Many of you have been following the war in Ukraine, following it closely. On November 11th, the Kremlin announced that it was completing a successful withdrawal from the west bank of the Dnipro and Kherson, freeing the last major Ukrainian city that was held by Russian forces since Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 23rd. Using a successful recipe of US applied long-range precision fires, or as they're sometimes known as six packs of MLRSs, known as the Guided Multiple Launch Rocket System, GMLRS, built by Lockheed Martin. Ukraine has been using these weapons very effectively, pushing back Russian forces using this modern weaponry to turn the tide on the battlefield. And so it's combined with these weapons and the heroics of the Ukrainian army, they're pushing the Russian army to the brink of defeat in Ukraine. As we enter discussion today, we have many outstanding questions as the war enters this different stage. One is that is Ukraine facing the culminating point of victory, or will the war linger on into the spring of 2023, when new recruits fill the ranks of the Russian army to create a new phase in the second year of the war? Or will Ukraine repeat its recipe for victory by pushing on to Melitopol and advance to the gates of Crimea in the coming weeks, and finally end President Putin's dream of creating a Novorossiya, the so-called land bridge to Odessa? So we're delighted that with this changing status of the war to Ukraine's military advantage, we're just particularly enthusiastic that General Hodges is here with us today. He's been, many generals could have retired and gone on to do different things, but he stayed in the game and been very active on Ukraine and through a variety of speaking and writing. And so we're just delighted he's here. So Ben, the floor is yours.
Glenn, thank you. And those of you that braved the weather to come here, I'm particularly grateful. And those who got up early to listen online, I'm grateful. Actually, as I look around the room, and obviously I know of most of you, and as I looked at the list of people that were participating virtually, the whole room is full of people that already know exquisite detail about what's going on a day-to-day basis. You're familiar with the geography and all of that and the issues. So what I would like to do is, the opportunity, Glenn, that you've given me, is put 4 or 5 sort of big points on the table and then try and defend them. And this is also how I do my research, is when I get a chance to talk to a group of other people that care about the subject or get drilled by Michael, it helps me think about, make sure I don't fall in love with my own optimistic assumptions and assessments, okay? And of course, those of you who do know me know that I am an optimistic heart, and so you can take a dose of salt with any of my assessments, but I stand by them. But first of all, Ukraine has achieved irreversible momentum. There's no going back. They have irreversible momentum. Here we are at over 9 months, and you look at the part of Ukraine that Russia controls after they started with every possible advantage, and the amount of territory that they hold at this point is, I think, a commentary on the potential for the very dim prospects that they have for the future. In fact, I see 0 bright lights on the horizon for the Russian Federation or for the Kremlin with regards to Ukraine, and frankly, the broader future. I mean, it's pretty grim. If you're sitting in the Kremlin, if you're honest with yourself, and you're looking at the map, and you're looking at statistics, and you're getting honest assessments, it'd be hard to be too cheerful about what the next several months hold. But I would also add that it is too early to be planning victory parades. There are going to be several months of terrible, hard fighting going on. Thousands more innocent Ukrainian people are going to be murdered by Russian rockets and missiles and drones. That still lies ahead of us. But I believe that the Russian Federation's only hope is to drag this out long enough that the West loses the will to fight, loses the will to support. And I have to say, every time I hear anybody, no matter how well intentioned or how well informed they are, when they use the word negotiate or security guarantees for Russia, that is like a week's worth of oxygen that flows right back into the Kremlin. And it's unhelpful at this point. So that's kind of the upfront piece. I'm going to switch to a map here in a second, but clearly the center of gravity for Ukraine's success is support from the West. And without that, it will be long, hard, and Russia will not be forced to leave Ukraine without Western support, whether it's long-range weapons, intelligence, all sorts of other logistical support, all the different things that are being provided. Without that, and then of course keeping the sanctions in place, without that, it would be very difficult for them to achieve the desired end state, which is total restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty of all of their territory. So the Russians, of course, recognize what that center of gravity is, and that's why they're going after the power grid to make Ukrainian cities untenable during the winter, and to wreck the Ukrainian economy so that Ukrainians head to the West and put pressure on European capitals to in turn put pressure on Kyiv. And then the tens of thousands of young and not so young Russian males who were not clever enough to get out of Russia when the mobilization started are being fed to the slaughter. And they're literally trading bodies for time. I mean, there are hundreds per day getting killed in places like Bakhmut, as well as other parts of eastern Ukraine. And it is solely for the purpose of buying time. So that's how I see it. Now, just a brief thing up front. The reason I wanted to show the regional map of the greater Black Sea region, and of course you'll have already spotted there's a couple of bits of it that are out of date, but I pulled it out of storage yesterday. This was a map we used to use when I was at SEPA. The gray areas were, of course, back then, before February, we referred to them as the frozen conflicts. The ones in Georgia are still so, and Transnistria, of course, but the part of Ukraine that is where there is fighting now, it's obviously not frozen anymore, and the shaded area is no longer accurate. So please forgive me for that. But the reason I like to show this map is because I think it's important that we all remind ourselves and remind others, particularly people who provide support or should be providing support for Ukraine, why this matters. I mean, when I hear knuckleheads talk about, wow, we should be spending this money at home, or why do we care about them, or the Ukrainians are corrupt, or it always was Russia, or different nonsense like that, we need to be, I think, aggressive in pushing back on it. Obviously, the Black Sea is not a lake in the middle of nowhere by itself. It's important for Russia, but it's also important for us, and by us I mean the West. We've got 3 NATO allies that are there, so we have Washington Treaty obligations to be able to help defend Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria. So there's a treaty obligation for why the Black Sea should matter for us. Stopping Russia in Ukraine is important for America's strategic interest in terms of our economy. Europe, the European Union, is our biggest economic partner. And so American prosperity is tied directly to European prosperity. And if European countries are on fire, if Russia is able to just keep moving through Europe, then we are going to have, that's going to damage our economy. So in a almost kind of a selfish sort of way, American economic interests depend on European economic interests, which depends on stability and security in Europe. So there's a direct, if you're talking to a member of Congress, for example, or another influencer who says, you know, why do we care? It's in our interest, not just because we like Ukrainians. And then, of course, the Chinese are watching. the Chinese are watching to see, can the United States, can Germany, can Poland, can the West get through some tough economic challenges and continue to support Ukraine and help Ukraine defeat Russia. If we can't, particularly given Russia's weakened state, if we can't stick together for that, then I think the Chinese are not too impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan or South China Sea or other aspects of that. So, as I think about all the excuses or problems or whatabouts from candidly Republican members of Congress, but not only, there were some progressives also that complained about this. These are reasons why, 3 big reasons, well beyond just Ukraine, that I think this matters for all of us. Now, there is potential, of course, for economic development in the region. If you look at Georgia, where it sits, and you see Anaklia just above the port of Poti, if that port in Anaklia was ever developed to be the deep water port that they would like it to be, then Azerbaijan and Georgia become a portal between Europe and Eurasia. And then all of a sudden you start seeing significant increase in economic movement from east to west. And Romania would be a huge benefactor, or would benefit from this significantly, because then there will be pressure on the port of Constanta, and then that puts pressure on the Danube. And so there's a lot of economic demands that would go up, and several nations would benefit, which of course is exactly why the Kremlin has put so much pressure on, I think, through Ivanishvili and the Georgia Dream Party, not to let the port of Anaklia ever develop, because that's the last thing they want, is a bunch of European countries or the United States starting to invest in Georgia and then start paying attention to, why do you still have Russian troops in South Ossetia and Abkhazia? So there's an economic aspect to this as well. Your other choices, if you don't take that Black Sea sort of Euro economic corridor, your choices are to go through Russia or to go through Iran, in terms of the 3 big sort of corridors for economic purposes. That's another reason I think that the Black Sea matters. Okay, let's get to a little bit more detail now. And again, most of you guys will be familiar with this detail. In fact, all of you will have seen these maps because they were either came out on Twitter, or ISW continues to be an exceptionally good source for maps. So none of this will be a surprise for you, but I wanted to use it to illustrate a couple of things. I flat out disagree with the administration's policy about ATACMS, about armored vehicles. I don't understand it. I hear the justifications for it, but none of them are compelling to me. Now, I am retired, and I get all of my information from reading things that each of you puts out and having conversations like this. So I intentionally don't go seeking classified information, because I don't want to have it and worry about what I'm saying in that regard. I suspect part of the reason from the White House or the Pentagon is, this is not happening in a vacuum. I think the Chinese have a lot to do with this, or whatever conversations or influence coming from China about risks of escalation, or making sure that China does not get involved in an active way of providing things to Russia. That may be one of the reasons that the administration and other Western capitals are reluctant. I don't know that for a fact. I've been trying to understand, why is it that we are reluctant to do something that looks like such an obvious thing to do? It is almost exactly 300 kilometers from Odessa to Sevastopol, almost exactly 300 kilometers. So if you had ATACMS or HIMARS firing ATACMS from Odessa, Sevastopol would already be untenable. The Black Sea Fleet would have had to have left there. And of course, everything else that's in and around the Crimean Peninsula would also be untenable if you had ATACMS. They don't have it. And so the Ukrainians, of course, are not going to sit around and wait on us. So the top left map there that shows the concentric rings, that shows basically from Kherson what you can reach. And I think most of you have seen this map already, both with the gimbalers now. That's the inner blue ring. So the beautiful thing about that, of course, is that all this hand wringing about, oh my God, the Russians are digging defenses and they're big trenches and they're and they're out there after they pull back from Kherson. I would hate to be a Russian private sitting in one of those trenches or bunkers over the next 3 months with my winter warfare uniform that was manufactured in North Korea, and I'm sitting inside HIMARS range and all the other systems that are going to be raining down on me. So actually, and this has impressed me about the Ukrainian general staff. They have been very methodical, very disciplined, very professional, very Clausewitzian actually in their operational design. They're not in a hurry. They don't need to be in a hurry to get down into Crimea. I think they're going to use the next 2 months as a setting the conditions. I don't think it's a lull in the terms of we're exhausted. You know, we're not going into winter quarters like in the 18th century because there was no forage for the horses. They are setting conditions, and that's going to be continuous pressure on Ukrainian defense, Russian defenses using drones, long-range fires, and I think probably we're going to see plenty of reports about sabotage, other activities in the Russian rear area. I would also hate to be a Russian truck driver in any convoy moving through this part of occupied Ukraine. So that's what's going to be happening, I think, for the next 2 months. And of course, building up. So it's not a lull in terms of we're tired. It's operational pause, condition setting, and getting ready for the decisive phase. I think that the Ukrainians will be ready to begin the decisive phase of the campaign, which is the liberation of Crimea, by February. So December, January is setting conditions. And that map on the top left there shows what they can do already with HIMARS. And then if you think about, and I like the map on the right, when you see the other land bridge there, the one that runs from Rostov through Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, and down into Crimea. I mean, there's only two landlines of communication, two that go into Crimea. And as I look at that map and I think about the range of weapons, Kerch Bridge is already damaged, even though the president of the Russian Federation apparently took a truck ride out on part of it yesterday. It will be several weeks before it's fully operational again, assuming it doesn't get hit again, which I would be surprised if it doesn't. That's pretty fragile. You got two lines of communication bringing in all the fuel, ammunition, all the stuff needed for Crimea, which has got tens of thousands of not just Russian troops, but people that are there. To be able to sustain that through the winter, that's going to be a tough logistical task, especially if you're having to use trucks and not rail. So I think the general staff is focused on those two lines of communication. And Crimea, to me, starts looking increasingly like a trap. I mean, that's not where I'd want to be. Now, of course, there's several holes in my assessment that you'll have already spotted. Number one assumes that Ukrainians will have enough ammunition to continue pounding away with long-range precision fighters. I do believe that precision can defeat mass, which is what we're talking about here, but it takes a long time and a lot of precision capability. But again, I've been impressed with how the general staff has organized that. The map on the bottom left-hand corner is one other kind of conceptual to illustrate what I think the overall design. If you think about the Ukrainian counteroffensive that really started in early September, the preparation for it, of course, began back in the spring as the Ukrainians were fighting against Russian forces. And I think the Russian forces, or the Ukrainian general staff, could see that the Russians were going to culminate probably by August. I mean, they know all of them. They know exactly what capabilities the Russians have. They understand the culture, mentality, the organizational design, and they understand what logistical and industrial capacity the Russians have. And I think that they had identified that the Russian offensive was going to culminate in August. And of course, you know, Clausewitz and the culminating point, the whole purpose of him explaining the culminating point, this is where the attacker culminates, loses impetus, either because of resistance, too many casualties, morale factors, logistics, all those things. They could see that the Russians were going to culminate sometime in August, which they did. And the reason you would want to identify the culminating point is, and I'm sure all of you in your own copy of Own War, you've got that page dog-eared already, is so that the defender can identify, anticipate when you want to counterattack, when you're going to a counteroffensive or a counter-strike of some sort, when the attacker is at the weakest, is running out of steam. And then that's when you want to hit. So you want to anticipate that. And then you start backing up. How long will it take me to have enough ammunition, enough people, get things in place to set the conditions so that we can attack? And of course, I can remember most of us in August, we kept hearing about this big Kherson counteroffensive, the summer offensive. When's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? That was genius. I mean, the Ukrainian General Staff had all of us talking about the big summer southern counteroffensive that was going to Kherson. I mean, it was, and even General Zaluzny played an important part, I thought, when he said, everybody, please shut up, quit talking about, which attracted even more attention to it. And the Russians obligingly moved most of their airborne units down to Kherson and left Kharkiv and the area around Kharkiv uncovered, except for a mix of Wagner, some other untrained guys, and some the National Guard. Yeah. So you had a mixed, incoherent group of forces up there, and of course that was, I believe, the main effort. And so the slide on the bottom left, where it shows two, these are meant to be conceptual, not something you could navigate with or just fire off of. But nonetheless, think of it as the Kherson was the right fist or the right wing, and the Kharkiv was the left wing. And so you had two completely different sort of, the texture of each of them was different. That was not accidental, I don't think. The one towards Kherson, of course, they were going towards a much more heavily defended area. You've got the gigantic Dnipro River right there. There's a lot of different factors. Whereas in Kharkiv, it was a much less coherent defense, less qualified forces. And so the Ukrainians were able to exploit there. And I think, I haven't read transcripts, so I don't know this for a fact, but it looks to me that the left wing had the authority to make a lot of decisions at the local level. Commanders were exploiting. So I mean, if you follow all the little arrows, they were not one big red arrow headed towards one thing. There were multiple places where commanders were exploiting weaknesses. And the idea, of course, in operational design is to create this sort of breakthrough, and then you start rolling, and undisciplined units get very, very uneasy when somebody's in their rear. Disciplined units deal with it because they know that, you know, those things will often peter out. Undisciplined, untrained units will react differently. And that's what we saw happening. And that's why you saw the speed and momentum picking up. And I think that the design continues to be that the left wing is going to continue moving down towards Mariupol. And the purpose, of course, is to completely sever that other land bridge. And they're already almost within HIMARS range now of being able to do that. Of course, you can't just park a bunch of HIMARS wheel to wheel and expect them to survive. But the fact is, that's in range, which means other drones are in range, other weapon systems are increasingly in range. So I think that's the design. And then ultimately, Crimea is the prize. All roads lead to Crimea. And that's what this is about. I spoke with a Ukrainian friend, like all of you, and I'm constantly either on the phone with people, I'm reading, I'm asking, get to participate in a couple of different things where Glen Howard, the eternal fountain of insight and information, sometimes wrong, but nonetheless, no, the information is never wrong. It's your analysis that I disagree with sometimes. But, you know, we're all fighting for information, trying to understand what's going on. And I was talking to a Ukrainian colonel the other day who would be in a position to know. And I said, why? So why did it seem like you let people get away in Kherson, but you were able to crush in Kharkiv? And he described, said, well, first of all, you had two different situations as I described. And it was a conscious decision to avoid the casualties because the Ukrainians suffered a lot of casualties in this successful breakthrough up near Kharkiv. Literally were rushing in, even against untrained people, you can still suffer a lot of casualties, which they did. And I think there was a determination that there was not a need, it would not be worth to suffer all those casualties if the Russians were going to be pulling out of Kherson anyway. I still don't know. Some of you may have a better idea. I still don't know how much equipment, how many people the Russians actually left behind or lost there. I mean, I didn't see long columns of prisoners walking down the highway like in 1944 or 45.
Well, that's the Russian view, is that it was an organized retreat.
Yeah,
And Kherson was an organized retreat,
Right.
you know.
and it could be, but it clearly was. It looks to me that Ukrainians made the decision, we're going to do what we can with fires, but there's no need to suffer thousands of casualties or hundreds of casualties trying to fight our way into Kherson just yet. So here we are now in first week of December. The right wing is in a position from which it doesn't have to cross the river right now, frankly. I mean, there's no rush to do that yet. So for the next 2 months, I think they're going to be pounding away at Ukrainian or Russian defenses in that area north of the Perekop Isthmus. And the left wing is going to continue working its way south down towards Mariupol at some point. Obviously, I have no idea what the trigger will be for a transition, if there is a big transition in this offensive. I do imagine that the Russians they can read a map too, but I can't tell what their defensive scheme is or what sort of a counteroffensive that they have in mind. I see reports like all of you do that they're building up troops. There's possibly another mobilization coming, all of that, but it's fighting around Bakhmut, for example. That seems totally disconnected from anything else that's going on. I mean, I think this is Prigozhin's, he's got his own little thing going. I'm pretty certain he does not take any orders from the General Staff or Shoigu. And I think he's out there. If you think about it, if he's the best they have, or he seems to have the most assets, and Bakhmut is not, I don't think any of us had ever heard of Bakhmut. You probably did, but nobody else has ever heard of it until now. I mean, it's not a strategically important place, and yet they're just pouring people in there. So it seems disconnected from what else is going on. So I don't see a coherent Russian defense or counteroffensive yet. I could be totally wrong on that. Let me close with this part. Some quick observations. Most of these will be well known to you already, but when I heard them the other day, I thought, well, this is a useful way to kind of start thinking back, because a lot of us are starting to think about lessons learned or what are the implications of what's happening. And I thought these were useful. Number one, hard power is back, obviously. That doesn't mean we don't want diplomacy, we don't want all the other types of soft power, but we see what happened before February, that soft power alone absolutely does not work. And if you don't have hard power, then soft power is not going to be effective. Otherwise, Luxembourg would rule the entire world. So you have to have something to back that up. The second thing is that kinetic effects produce results. I mean, you do have to kill people. You do have to destroy stuff. I think the sinking of the Moskva completely changed the entire maritime domain for this war. The Black Sea Fleet is nowhere to be seen. I mean, they'll launch some Iskanders, but otherwise they're hiding in and around Sevastopol, so that they're protected. They're underneath a ground-based air defense. And Ukraine doesn't even have a navy. I mean, I guess they have a navy with some. Sure.
They don't have a navy.
Right. But yet the Great Black Sea Fleet is nowhere to be seen. And I think it was the sinking of Moscow, and then there was, some other things that Ukrainians have done with anti-ship missiles, drones, and so on. That produces a result. Legacy weapon systems work. I think almost every bit of the technology that's being used today was designed in the 90s or earlier. I mean, there are some versions of drones that are newer developed, but the idea of unmanned systems, obviously, all the armor. I mean, HIMARS is not new. Patriot, well, we don't have Patriot yet, but the other systems, when they're not new, what's the point of that? The point is that there is no magical system. Like if we just give them this, they'll win. Or if the Russians just had this, they would win. It is at the end of the day always going to be about trained, disciplined, well-led, properly equipped women and men that are able to fight. And then do you take advantage? How fast can you adapt the systems that you have? Can you employ? You've got your quadcopters out there doing targeting for HIMARS. Okay. That would have never even occurred to me the whole time I was in uniform. So I mean that's an adaptation, and the Ukrainians are the best that I have seen. I've already mentioned this, but I'll say it again: precision can beat mass. So just got to make sure you've got enough precision ability that can defeat enough of the enemy's mass. The Chinese Navy, I mean, because these things have application for the Pacific. You know, the Chinese have a shipbuilding program right now that looks like the United States in 1944. It's 24/7, 3 shifts. That's not normal shipbuilding, but that's generating mass. That doesn't necessarily equal a great PLA Navy. So the U.S. Navy and our allies are going to have to be able to counter against a lot more Chinese ships than we have. The fifth one is obvious. I know in this town it gets a lot of conversation. Production capacity remains vital in warfare. There is one little factory in Camden, Arkansas that makes HIMARS rockets and also Javelin. That's it. And if it, they have a big problem there. I mean, we're in a hurt. And I think if Secretary Austin wrote a check for $1 billion today and gave it to them, it would still be close to a year before we would see a noticeable increase in production. It's not because they're not lazy or clever. It's just to make these things and supply chain and all the stuff that goes into it. Now, of course, again, Secretary Austin and his team, they've been on this case now for several months. But it has reminded us that every one of us, including all of our NATO allies, not just the U.S., we do not have enough stuff. And I can understand why members of the Congress or the Parliament or the Bundestag, they don't want to spend a lot of money on things that you hope you never use. So there's a legitimate concern about how much ammunition do you have to have in storage to have effective deterrence. Clearly, we don't have enough right now. And then the last sort of big observation for me is the importance of positive galvanizing leadership from the platoon to the president and everywhere in between. Positive leadership that explains why this is important, why we're doing it, to be able to communicate that remains very important. I mean, all of us probably, certainly I have been impressed with President Zelensky. I mean, he's probably done more than any other one individual on the planet to galvanize people through how his leadership efforts, his presence, and how he communicates. I would also say our president has played that kind of a role. And when you have galvanizing positive leadership at every level, that inspires that will to win, which is, as we all know, essential. Okay, look forward to challenges or questions or help. I'd like to get it right. I mean, if we're on the places where you think I'm totally wrong, I would expect to hear it, because I'm interested in getting it right.
Ben, thank you for that excellent overview and assessment. I mean, you offer insight that few people can offer at a military and operational level. And my question to you is, you keep repeating the theme that precision can defeat mass, but it seems the administration wants to, as Michael Gordon's piece yesterday in the Wall Street Journal was kind of highlighting, is that they want to provide just enough assistance to maintain a kind of status quo in the battlefield, but not one that can win. And you got on the other hand, on the opposite side of the battlefield, Putin is clearly not, he's preparing for next spring. He's throwing everything but the kitchen sink into this. But the model for him is he's got mass. Now you can argue all you want about whether the Russian army is effective or not, but they've got a lot of men and mobilization power, and they've got a desire to keep moving and keep striking. And this is at a time when Ukraine's lost 50% of its electrical power to these airstrikes by Russian cruise missiles using technology from the 1960s. So, you've talked about culminating point of victory, but this precision defeat mass, I mean, we're, it was reported yesterday that the U.S. has gone through in 13 years of Stinger missiles we've completely exhausted our stockpiles. So we're reproducing all this. So is Putin, you think from a military perspective that Putin is just betting here that this mass will keep kind of exhausting Ukraine and exhausting us to the point next spring? Ukraine has a lot of manpower, true, and it's got a weapon supply, but it seems like the Russians are kind of have a different type of a strategy that's more of attrition-based model, which we're not used to in the West. I mean, we're used to kind of counterinsurgency warfare, full to gap. We don't have 100,000, 200,000 men, with 5 armored divisions. I mean, but Ukraine is holding its own. But this is my concern and question to you, is that this precision can precision keep defeating mass at this stage and going into next year?
Excellent points and counter. The precision that I'm talking about, of course, is against that mass, specifically the logistics. I mean, if you can continue to disrupt, disable the ability of the Russians to bring in more of that mass, that's what I'm talking about. Or when you can hit ammunition storage points, when you can make Sevastopol untenable. I mean, the Russians have already moved their submarines out of there after the first drone strike on that fort back about 3 months ago. That's what I'm talking about, that it becomes, they're unable to use or employ all their mass. Now, when you got hundreds of Russians coming at you, fighting around these villages, you're going to have mass artillery, your own artillery, to be able to defeat that. But over time, if the Russians, and clearly you're right, they have decided that they're going to trade bodies for time, that they're going to just keep bringing in more and more people as long as they can find them. That's the approach. Now, I'm not sure, in fact, I'm skeptical that their logistics system could actually sustain that. I mean, 100,000 troops, untrained troops, still eat uniform. You got to move around. Half of them at least have to have a weapon. I mean, there's things that go into that. I'm not convinced that they can sustain that.
Michael, question? Michael Jordan.
Or Jordan.
Michael.
Michael Jordan.
For our guests watching today, this is Michael
here.
Not as much hang time.
So, Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. I'd like to follow up on Glen's point. So some years ago, I was with the Russian army in Chechnya for the Second Chechen War, and I saw many of their deficiencies, which are evident today. That said, it seems that the Russians have an asymmetric advantage in that they have a sanctuary. If you look at the situation now, the Ukrainians do not have ATACMS, and they're highly unlikely to ever get them from the West. They don't have aircraft from the West, and they're not going to get those. They may not even get Soviet-era aircraft from Eastern European nations. They don't have Gray Eagles. The administration's turned that down. They don't have main battle tanks. So many of the things that they would need to apply this precision in Crimea, they don't have, and they're very unlikely to get. And when General Milley says that the Ukrainians may have reached their high water mark, he may be speaking a truth in the sense that with what the West is prepared to give them, they may not be able to go much further. Second, on the integrated air defense, that Milley's clearly overpromised on that. They don't have an integrated air defense. They're going to get 6 more NASAMS 18 months from now. They're going to get an Iris-T or 2 from Germany and some IHawks from Spain. There's nothing that's going to make them immune from these airstrikes. And yes, it was nice and interesting that the Ukrainians did some drone strikes and took out their 2 fewer Bear bombers. But this is not going to remove the Russian, erase the Russian advantage in the air or from afar. And it seems like nor are they running out of munitions, according to the Conflict Armament Research Group, which said some of the parts they found are more modern. So that may be wishful thinking on the part of the West. So my question is, we saw in Afghanistan, it's really hard to defeat an enemy that has a sanctuary in a neighboring country. Russia has a sanctuary. They can fire cruise missiles, ballistic missiles from Russian Federation territory, from the Black Sea. Even if only 20% of them get through, they have a devastating effect on Ukraine's infrastructure. There's nothing that the West is proposing to do and that Ukraine is capable of doing that's going to change that. So recognizing that one side has a sanctuary and the other side doesn't, how do you come up with such an optimistic assessment that Ukraine has irreversible momentum that will allow them to retake the Crimean Peninsula?
Well, as I expected, very, very good challenges and encounters, Michael. Of course, Ukraine does have sanctuaries. I mean, they have all of Europe behind them. And the same way you describe Russian sanctuary, I mean, from their own country, Ukraine has all of its own country behind it, as well as Europe. So I take your point, but I don't know that the one has sanctuary and the other one doesn't. And of course, I would defer to your experience with Chechnya, but there was nobody else supporting Chechnya at the time. So it was, the Russians did this. Well, the first time came back in there, finished it, and nobody else was helping the Chechens too much that I'm aware of. Air missile defense is a huge problem. Obviously, we don't have enough. That was always my number one concern when I was commander of U.S. Army Europe. We had 1 Patriot battalion for all of Europe, and it takes a battalion to protect Ramstein. So that's it. And I failed among many failed assessments on my part. I didn't dream that the Russians would launch multi-million-dollar missiles against apartment buildings. So our requirement for air missile defense obviously is 1,000 times more than just protecting Bremerhaven and Gdansk and places like that. So that is absolutely a real problem, and the department and the alliance are going to have to figure out ways to increase this integrated air missile defense, which is, as you know, sensors spread out over multiple countries in multiple places, different types of shooters, who's making the decisions. And when you have a dull moment, I would ask, how come UCOM has not done, or NATO has not done, a theater-wide joint multinational air defense exercise, at least in the last 10 years? Okay, so I would, this is an area that is of huge concern. For the drones, the Iranian drones that are part of this onslaught, how is it that, I think what we're discovering is that they're packed with American-made parts that are not necessarily getting into Iranian hands illegally. I mean, I haven't done enough research on this, but somehow there's holes in the system that Iran can get parts, components necessary to make a pretty effective drone, and then hand them over to the Russians. So being able to attack that throughout its depth, from the factory through the delivery to the technicians to the launching sites, however that's happening, is something that's got to be done. It's not just about protecting the critical assets. I don't know it. And one of the major flaws in my analysis is that I don't know how much the Russians started with. It does clearly they have apparently endless amounts of artillery ammunition. How many more Iskanders type precision weapons do they have? I'm sure it's finite because of sanctions, or that they can make reduced quality, perhaps. But what they have, they seem to have an awful lot. I don't have a counter for that. The sanctions, of course, are going to have to continue to limit the Russians' ability to continue to make the products that they make. But I also, part of the reason for my optimism is that after 9 months of all that they have done, I see zero cracks in the will of the Ukrainian people. I see a Ukrainian military that is so much better today than it was 9 months ago. They have 700,000 plus people in uniform. That's not 700,000 fully trained, Ranger qualified, top to bottom, but 700,000 already, and 2 million more behind them. So manpower will not be a problem for them, whereas the Russians, I think, have a significant manpower problem. And of course, I keep going back to the map and these two lines of communication. And at some point, the Russians will have to make a decision. Is it worth it? Can they continue to sustain what's in Crimea? How tenable is that? And without the Navy, and without their Navy being a significant player, and without their Air Force actually being a real significant contributor, I remain optimistic. But you highlight several flaws in my optimism.
Ben, we have a question from some of the viewers online, and one is from Matt Ryan, who says, asking a question, we've been hearing about the diminishing stores of Russian precision missiles. How do you assess the ability of Russia to sustain its barrages of long-range missile and artillery attacks? And what are the military factors that might lead Russia to decide they need to negotiate an end to the conflict?
Well, Michael, you make a great point that, knocking out 2 Bear bombers is not going to change the outcome of the war unless we see that Ukraine and the Russians now see that Ukraine has the ability to strike a target 300 or 400 miles away. I don't have, they didn't lose the recipe for this thing. So they can make more of these, presumably, which means that all of Crimea starts becoming, is now within range. I mean, stand fast, whether or not you get attack them, that's a real capability. And if that was a proof of principle for them, a live fire test, and it worked, holy hell, then I think a lot of other places start becoming vulnerable on the Russian side. So I don't know the answer to how much longer can they keep doing what they're doing, but this capability that the Ukrainians may have revealed here in the last 24 hours would make it possible for the Ukrainians to start getting the initiative on those kinds of capabilities.
There was yesterday, there was the report by the New York Times that said the strikes on Saratov and Ryazan were facilitated by Ukraine special forces operating behind Russian lines, directing the drone strikes. Does that sound plausible?
Well, U.S. special forces have been doing that for years. So
I mean, obviously you don't mean within Russian territory, but when you hear about Ukraine special forces units operating deep behind Russian lines.
Why is that even hard to believe? I mean, to me, that seems eminently believable. The ability for Ukrainians to move around inside Russia, however they were doing it, is a lot more plausible than people that look like me moving around inside Iraq or Afghanistan or Kuwait. So, which is what we've been doing for decades now. So, I'm not making light of it, but to me, it seems entirely plausible. And again, I mean, Ukraine was the part of the defense industry of the Soviet Union. So most of the technological expertise and engineering skill is in Ukraine. So, and hundreds of thousands of young Russians, IT specialists have already departed Russia. So I think there's a technological, to me, it's entirely believable that Ukraine would have the ability to have the technology and the people that would be able to do that. Now, we don't know, nor should we know, how they actually did it. And that was the other thing I meant to mention earlier that's impressed me about the general staff. We know so much more about Russian forces than we do about Ukrainian forces, which is as it should be. We should not know what their plans are and who's doing what. And I think they have shown a discipline in the iPhone age, which is astounding.
So therefore, when the administration is saying, well, we don't want to give you weapons because, long range GMLRs will, escalate situation. I mean,
Attack them.
yeah, and with the attack, I mean, to me, that's just kind of ludicrous because they're already operating behind Russian lines. What else? I mean, this war is escalating already. So, to me, it seems like as we're at this turning point, that our goal and mission should be try to help Ukraine get this war over with and knock the Russians out as soon as possible, rather than, going into the second year. Come on.
I'm with you 100%. We're actually into the 9th year, but yes,
Yeah, that's true.
left 10.
Anybody, any questions here? Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
And
My
please
name is
identify yourself.
Alexei Goncharenko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. I'm from Odessa. Thank you, General Hodges, for your analysis. Thank you to Jamestown for organizing this event. I just here for several days because I'm trying to lobby for more weaponry to Ukraine, exactly what you are saying. And I already hate the word escalatory. I don't know, and this word is quite really strange. So you already said about this, but there are some types of weaponry which you, even with all your will, couldn't define as escalatory, like air defense, and still were not provided with it. And that is a big problem. And it is very frustrating because it feels like all the time the West is chasing after, because I was the first month in territorial defense when I defended here. And I saw that if we would have in March the weaponry we received in May, we would finish everything in April, which was completely possible. They were retreating, disorganized. Then it was again window of opportunity in summer. Then again, when Putin started mobilization, it was clear that it will take near 2 months before troops will arrive. And all the time we're a little bit behind. So I hope one day we will make the step ahead and we'll finish it. So that's my first point, just to share it with you. And it looks like some people in Washington, they really want Ukraine to win, but at the same time, they don't want Russia to be defeated. And like it cannot be at the same time, but they in some way don't realize it. And that is the problem. But my question is to you as to a military man and of high profile and authority. So about Belarus, there are a lot of movements in Belarus. Shoigu came, they're making some preparations, they're like training the troops and so on. So what is your assessment? What's going on? They really want to attack. They want to divert the forces, Ukrainian forces, from the battle line. How dangerous will be this attack? So the situation there, because I consider Belarus to be just occupied by Russia already. Russian troops, they are there without no legal reason for this. So how Putin will use this part now?
I think that the possibility, of course, exists that the Russians would open up another front. But with what? I mean, I don't think that they have, that I'm aware of, significant capability that could threaten Kyiv, for example. I think that and we know that the general staff is obviously aware of this, that the Ukrainian general staff is taking this into account, preparing, against that possibility. And I think that's actually the aim of the Russians, is to force Ukraine to have to deal with something else. Distraction is not the right word, but to have to divert resources in case of that. Again, I could be proven wrong immediately, but I don't see the real possibility of it. I think this is a continuation of Mr. Lukashenko continuing his method of give the Russians just enough so that they don't knock him out, but not doing enough that he would that he would lose. I think Belarus has about 10 DTGs. I doubt any of them are even as good as any Russian units. And I think Lukashenko knows that those 10 units will be destroyed by Ukrainian forces within days. I think he also is worried about the hundreds of thousands of opposition people that would see opportunity or would be motivated to do something, whether it was more sabotage, which has already happened, or something more significant. I can't predict that, but I think those are the things he's thinking about. And as long as he can get away with tolerating presence and, of course, missiles being launched out of Belarus, without actually having to send his own troops or to allow something more significant. I think that's what he'll continue to do.
There's a question from Douglas Carr who asks online, what would be the biggest challenge for Ukraine if they launch a thrust towards Melitopol or Mariupol region?
If the Ukrainians do that,
Yeah. What would be the biggest challenge for Ukraine?
well, of course, they would have to suppress the Russian artillery because of the Russian art. Now, when you start moving towards Melitopol and Melitopol, now you're moving deliberately within range of Russian artillery. And so they would have to have accounted for that. And that's what I mean by condition setting, is to degrade Russian artillery as much as possible through knocking out ammunition, as well as destroying systems, headquarters with precision weapons. Otherwise, I mean, this is what the Russians would want, is Ukrainian columns moving into artillery range. So I think that would be the first and foremost what they would have to take care of. This is also why they need tanks and armored fighting vehicles, like whether it's a Marder or other infantry fighting vehicles, is to be able to do that offensive operation. I said at the beginning, I don't understand why the administration will not do that. I heard the German Minister of Defense say, well, tanks are offensive weapons. We defended West Germany for 4 decades with tanks. And so I don't get that. That's not very satisfying answer, I know, but I went to the tank plant in Kharkiv, by the way, back in 2017, the birthplace of the T-34. I mean, I'm an infantry guy. I like blowing up tanks, but I mean, the T-34 is the most famous tank in the history of the world. And to walk around that place was it was quite an education. It looked like what I imagined Cleveland looked like in the 50s. OSHA had never been there. I mean, smoking cigarettes or welding, sparks flying everywhere, but they were cranking out. They were doing battle damage repair on Ukrainian armor, and so I'm standing there next to the guy in charge of the crew. I mean, it was impressive. It was impressive watching them work on this. And the guy in charge there had been at that factory for 50 years. And he spoke no English, except he went better than Abrams. And that was the only English that I got from him. But he was very proud of what they were doing. And then I looked over and I saw a long row of brand new tanks. I mean, they still had the new car smell. I thought, what the hell are those things going to? This is back when it was still the ATO. Are these going to ATO? And they said, no, these are going to Thailand. What? They said, yeah, these are export tanks. We're selling these to Thailand. I said, you guys are humping our leg for Javelin and you're exporting top quality tanks. And he said, it was a business aspect to it. I still don't fully understand all the context of that, but it took a little bit of the shine off of where I was, because that was frustrating. I mean, of course, this was before February of this year, but at the time, Ukraine was exporting top quality tanks and asking for Javelin, when they could have easily been making.
Ben, we have a question from Joanna Gwozlowski online, who's asking, what specific instance do you see that would be Putin's breaking point to use tactical nukes? And that hasn't come up today. And you hear this discussion going on about Russian threats and using nuclear. What are your perspectives?
Well, it's a great question, but it's interesting because that question almost never comes up anymore. Not since, well, first of all, I think that the General Staff absolutely believes President Biden, that there would be catastrophic consequences. I think the General Staff believes that. And I think there is a lot of messaging that's been going to the Kremlin from European capitals about this. And clearly President Xi, who will never get the Nobel Peace Prize, when he says no nuclear war and threatening nuclear war, threatening the use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. From that point, it almost completely dropped off the screen. And I think that's because most people believe that the Kremlin knows that there is no battlefield advantage to using a nuclear weapon. There are only bad outcomes for them if they use any kind of a nuclear weapon. And that's why I think it is so unlikely. I would never say it's impossible. I mean, they have thousands of them, and they clearly don't care how many people get killed, even of their own. But in terms of, is it worth the retribution that would happen? And I think the general staff has said, there's nothing that they could do with a tactical nuclear weapon that would make it worth losing all of the Black Sea Fleet or all of their resources on Crimea or half of their land forces that are deployed or whatever other target might be selected for the president if to do a response.
Now, you served in Germany during the Cold War, and therefore you have had experience with preparations to train and fight in nuclear conditions. So in light of what you saw and in your last experience as Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe, what do you think the Russian problems would be in trying to say they use tactical nukes? I mean, they're already very highly disorganized. I mean, wouldn't there be a lot of risk to the Russians themselves, even in using it and trying to fight in conditions? I mean, that's not something that's something you have to train for.
No, it's a great point. So the tactical nuclear weapons, and I think there's a couple of old Cold Warriors in here as I look around. The purpose of the tactical nuclear weapon was to literally create a gap or an opening in NATO defenses somewhere. So for the Soviets, if they were going to attack North German plain, Fulda, whatever, and NATO defenses were being successful or looked like they were going to be able to stop the Soviet attack, a tactical nuclear weapon device would be used, launched by either rockets or artillery or maybe an aircraft that would literally blow a hole in the NATO defenses. And then there were echelons wearing all the proper kit and vehicles that were able to operate in a contaminated environment that would exploit that gap. I mean, that was the whole purpose for having a tactical nuclear weapon. We had them, of course, as a deterrent. So if if you're going to do that, then we're going to have the capability to do the same back to you. That you're exactly right. That requires a lot of training. It requires vehicles that can be sealed against protect people from contamination, and there's a whole lot that goes into it, and you have to practice that. And I don't see any evidence that they've got significant size units that are trained, properly equipped, and have practiced how to do that. So the whole point, in fact, I would say that their nuclear weapons are only effective as long as they don't use them. And we continue to deter ourselves because of this fear of escalation that I think is not ever going to happen. We were wringing our hands about providing Javelin back in February out of fear that if a Russian helicopter was shot down by a Ukrainian soldier using an American-made Stinger, that the Russians might escalate. I mean, how ridiculous does that sound now? And every time we've gone up a step on delivering something, they have not been able to escalate because they have nothing with which to escalate.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions here? Identify yourself, please.
I'm from the Romanian Embassy, Hodges. I'm a diplomat here in Washington. Thank you for your assessments and overview.
Can you speak up, please?
Yes. Well, my question is the following. When we are speaking about the missiles attack on Ukrainian critical infrastructure, including energy one, we think in terms of civilian impact. Do you think there is also an impact on the capacity of the Ukrainian army to function, I don't know, transportation, keeping the facilities to repair to this? So the military impact of these attacks.
Yeah, there has to be some impact for the ability to produce weapons, ammunition, things that Ukrainian defense industry is still doing, to move transportation networks. I mean, we're still trying to train tens of thousands of, the Ukrainians are training tens of thousands of new soldiers, members of territorial defense force. So if their power is intermittent or knocked out, obviously that's going to have an impact on their ability to generate force. So there is an impact in that regard. What I don't have a good feel for, and perhaps Member Dorado could explain it better. How much are we able to help mitigate the impacts of loss of power? I mean, I know that USAID and other countries are delivering lots of mobile power units. I mean, there's different things that are being done to help provide or interim power generation capability. The government would be the one setting priorities for what has to be kept running, who's going to be without. But in short answer, I'm sure there would have to be some impact on their ability to radar. I mean, the radar systems, you know, if they don't have their own independent power generation or headquarters, communications networks, I'm sure there must be.
You want to follow on question?
Second question about these attacks. Do you think providing this to Ukraine will be the factor to break this no win, no lose situation?
I don't know when no lose.
So keeping this that like
The question is about what role attackers will play.
would play, yes. So we are in this situation that it seems that Ukraine is not gaining, Russia is not losing, as we said. Do you think providing this will make a
Okay. So
difference?
I really generally try to avoid specific weapon systems and talk in terms of capability, because there are a lot of different weapons that would deliver the capability. And the capability that Ukraine needs, or one of them that they need, I believe, what they've said, are long-range precision fires. The ability to hit the place from which rockets and missiles are coming to them, the ability to hit logistic sites, the ability to hit headquarters, whether that's an ATACMS, which is the one we all talk about a lot, or it's some other type of rocket, or now it's a drone, or if it's somebody out there with a laser pointer that is able to strike. That's the key. ATACMS for sure is a system that has that capability, and I think being able to hit all the critical transportation nodes, ammunition storage, headquarters, and Sevastopol, and the air base. Don't grade me on my pronunciation, but Jankoy on the northern part of Crimea, that appears to be the main hub now in Crimea, where a lot of the air activity and other things are happening. So that would make a difference, yes. But I also believe that there is no one. I mean, we had all the technology in Vietnam, we had all the technology in Afghanistan, and not a good ending.
Are you aware of the situation with cluster ammunition to HIMARS? I mean, one of just maybe to add. And
The question is on HIMARS and cluster.
Yeah, it's not a question. I just want to tell, maybe you can at least to say several words about this. Ukraine today, we are asking for cluster ammunition to HIMARS. You said about ammunition problems, but there are thousands of ammunition cluster type to HIMARS here in the United States, and they are prepared for utilization. But because of lack of funding, year to year, they are not utilized, and they are still on the stocks. And today, Ukraine asking this from economical point of view, it's even cheaper for the United States to deliver them to Ukraine than to utilize them here. And but still, the decision is not made because of cluster ammunition. But neither the United States nor Ukraine, as you know, are the ratifiers of the convention which forbids using of cluster ammunition. And Russians are using cluster ammunition very extensively. And I can tell you from my personal experience, I've been under this challenge. So what do you think? Do we have any chance of like having this political decision to provide us with this?
Of course, I don't know the answer to that. But the first thing, as soon as you mention cluster munitions, which are a devastating weapon system, is, you know, what legal challenges would there be? And I think weapons that have high dud rates, for example, there would be, I imagine there are some legal problems with using cluster munitions or to hand them over. but I don't know.
As we know.
I mean, there's a reason they were designed. It was to defeat the Soviet forces.
Absolutely. We
yeah.
want to utilize them on Russian hats, not to utilize them here, just on
I'm
money of American taxpayers.
I'm with you.
Thank you,
I'm
General
with you,
Hodges.
but unfortunately, I have zero. It's a fair point, but I'm almost certain that it would be illegal.
As we know, just not. We're not trying to fire so this. It's just a political point. It's only political, not legal. That it's like not very good looking for some people.
Ben, we got a question from Greg Webbing. Question for you is, how would you grade Germany's support of Ukraine and its support of the EU commitment to Ukraine? How would you grade it?
Yeah, not good enough.
Not good enough. C plus.
Germany is, as we all know, the number 3 in terms of contribution of actual capabilities. Number 2 overall in terms of financial contributions. So it's doing better than anybody in Europe, except for UK in terms of amount of stuff provided. But that's not the metric that matters. I mean, are they providing what's needed? Now, unfortunately, they're able to hide behind the US because we're not willing or not prepared to provide tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. So the Germans say, well, why should we? If the US won't do it, why are we the bad guy? UK is not doing it. France is not, lots of nations are not doing it. I think that's pretty weak for the most powerful, richest country in Europe. But having said that, I listened to Chancellor Scholz in Berlin at the Berlin Security Conference last week. He was up on the stage next to the Norwegian Prime Minister Storrs, and I was quite impressed. I mean, I heard
With Schultz.
yes, I heard him say, we are going to stay with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Now, that doesn't equal 1 tank or 1 cluster munition, but the key, in my view, is that for Germany, as a leader within the European Union, to continue to support Ukraine, even as here we are, as the winter's approaching and gas prices and all that. For the average German family, the price of heating their home is 3 times what it was last year. That's not insignificant. I mean, imagine all of you, if your heating bill was all of a sudden 3 times what it was. So the fact that the German government, and I'm not an apologist for them, but there's definitely been a change of attitude there in Berlin and throughout most of Germany. They have a coalition government, which is literally foreign to us.
And they're putting a lot of pressure on Schultz, right?
Well, the Greens have turned into the Hog Party, but he is an SPD, and the SPD, of course, the Social Democrats are the lead inside this coalition. And the SPD is traditionally the one that was most pro-Russian. The whole Handeln durch Handeln, you get them to change through economic ties, which obviously was a total failure, which the president Steinmeier has said I was wrong, SPD. So Scholz is having to deal with a party that at its core is very, very reluctant to be involved in anything that looks like a conflict or support against Russia. So that's a political fact that's there. Having said that, they are providing everything, every type of weapon that Ukraine has asked for, except for tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and aircraft. They have them. I spoke to a guy from Rheinmetall a few weeks ago. They have hundreds of mortars sitting that are owned by
mortars.
Martyr. That's the
Infantry fighting vehicle.
Fighting vehicle. And obviously they're not on the showroom floor. I mean, they would have to be refurbished, but it would bring a capability, armor protection, mobility, and a really nice gun that would be very helpful for an offensive operation. But they're not willing to do that.
That's been a long demand to provide the mortars,
yes,
and they refuse to do so.
Yeah, and now one thing that they're doing, that's worth. This is not a headline, But without this, all the headlines will be bad. It's maintenance support. We know that war is a test of will, but it's also a test of logistics. And logistics is not just about supplies of ammunition. It's about, can you keep equipment running? And there are, I think, 8 different types of howitzers that have been donated to Ukraine, or donated, sold, given, whatever. So you can imagine there is different as an American Paladin M109, a 777, to a Polish Crab, a French Caesar, and the German Panzer Howitzer 2000. And there's a Czech howitzer out there. The Ukrainian soldiers call
Dana,
Yeah, Diana. Right. So you've got Ukrainian soldiers refer to it as the zoo, because you've got all the different animals that are out there. And obviously each one of these is a quality piece of equipment, but each one has a completely different set of repair parts and different maintenance requirements and different lubricants. And so right now, I think you could be confident in knowing that a significant amount of that artillery equipment, those pieces, are unserviceable right now. Right now, the Panzer Howitzer 2000 is exceptionally good howitzer. It's what if we had not canceled Crusader, I mean, it's that sort of technology and size. But the problem is it's a Ferrari, and the Ukrainians are driving it like a Jeep. And so, I mean, the rate of fire is not what the 2000 was designed for. And so it's in the shop a lot. And I think Ukrainians are doing exactly what they need to do. But that howitzer is needs a lot of maintenance.
And the same way with the Gepard, the air defense weaponry, the Ukrainians are driving and using the equipment, replacing barrels.
I think, well, that's more robust than the Panzer Howitzer 2000. It's on a Leopard chassis, but it does go through a lot of ammunition. And I was talking to a German friend who was very proud that he had served in a Gepard unit before. And of all the different parts of the German military, everybody that went into a Gepard regiment had to have achieved Abitur level education. I mean, you had to be like in the top 5% because it's a pretty sophisticated piece of equipment. But my point is, what Germany is doing, they're establishing a maintenance facility in Slovakia. They were doing it in Lithuania because Poland would not allow them to do it there. But now they've got it closer to Ukraine, where you can do maintenance on the Panzer Howitzer 2000 and other German provided equipment in Slovakia. I think so. We have what's called first, second, third level maintenance. First level maintenance is the operator, the crew. You drive a tank, you drive a Humvee, you are a part of a howitzer battery. There's certain maintenance that you do that you're trained to do, and it's pretty basic stuff to keep it just like you do on your own car. Then you have second level maintenance, which is at the unit level, where you've got actual trained mechanics. They have more capability. They have some parts, all the lubricants. That's Jiffy Lube for your car. Okay, that's second level. Third level maintenance is the depot, where the whole thing goes back. They take the engine out. They replace all the different big pieces. So there is no second and third level maintenance in Ukraine for all the donated equipment. So it has to go back to Slovakia or Poland or Lithuania or Germany. And so that's weeks without that piece of equipment. So there are some efforts to help deliver commercially that capability into Ukraine. Because if we're not going to have soldiers from the 21st Air Sustainment Command go into Ukraine to do it, then you got to find a commercial solution. I think some people are trying to do that.
Ben, you've been very gracious with your time. I know you're in demand here in Washington. We very much appreciate your conversation today. With this event will be posted on YouTube afterwards. And, really having you here and in person has been a great benefit. And we thank all of you for today for coming. Hope to see you again in another future event. Next time Ben is in Washington to share his perspectives, because it looks like this war is going to be continuing on into next year. So
At least till August.
at least till August. So thank you, everyone. And let's give Ben a